The neighbors had one. The people who followed the case online had several. Amateur investigators built elaborate timelines on forums, connecting dots that may never have been connected at all, constructing narratives out of fragments and feeling rather than anything confirmed. And somewhere underneath all of it, underneath the speculation, and the noise and the slow accumulation of unanswered years, a family was simply trying to survive, not knowing what happened to someone they loved. The theories weren't cruel, exactly. Most of them came from the same place that most things come from in cases like this: the desperate, very human need to make sense of something that stubbornly refuses to make sense on its own. When a person disappears without explanation, the mind fills that silence with whatever it can reach: kidnapping, foul play, a carefully constructed cover-up hiding something too dark to name in ordinary daylight. But what if the truth was something entirely different? What if the answer, when it finally arrived, wasn't the one anyone had been spending years building toward? What if all that searching had been pointed in a direction the evidence never actually supported? That is the question now sitting at the center of this case. Because according to investigators who spent years examining every element of Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, the narrative that took root in the public imagination, the one that spread quietly and settled into a kind of accepted story, may have been wrong from the very beginning. Not wrong in some minor or technical way. Wrong in a way that changes everything about how this case needs to be understood. The truth, it turns out, is more complicated than a kidnapping, more painful in its own quiet way than any cover-up, and far harder to hold than most people who followed this story were prepared for. There's a particular cruelty in not knowing. It is different from loss, genuinely different, in ways that matter. Loss has a weight to it that is painful but recognizable. Grief moves through you. It shifts, it evolves. It doesn't leave you, but it changes shape over time into something that can be carried differently than it was at the very beginning. Not knowing doesn't move. It stays exactly where it first landed, right in the middle of everything, and it refuses, stubbornly, to let you find solid ground beneath your feet. Nancy Guthrie's family lived inside that not knowing for longer than anyone should have to. And the community around her, the people she worked alongside, the friends who refused to let her name go quiet in their conversations. Long after the media had moved on to other things, they lived at the edges of it, close enough to feel the pressure of the open question, pressing against the ordinary days of their lives, far enough removed that their grief, while real, could exist alongside everything else in a way her family's grief simply could not. Nancy, by every account from people who actually knew her, was someone whose presence was genuinely felt. Not loudly. She wasn't the kind of person who needed to command a room or position herself at the center of any gathering. Her presence was quieter than that, more durable. She was steady in the way that some people simply are, as though consistency is built into the structure of who they are, rather than something they have to decide. She showed up. She paid attention. In a world where most relationships skim along the surface, Nancy was the kind of person who went deeper, who remembered the things you mentioned once in passing, who followed up on the things that mattered to you, who made people feel genuinely seen rather than merely acknowledged. That kind of person doesn't disappear without leaving a real and lasting absence behind them, which made the circumstances of what happened all the more disorienting to everyone left in her wake. There was no obvious event anyone could point to in the immediate aftermath, no visible fracture in the surface of her life. According to those close to her in the days before she vanished, her demeanor hadn't shifted in any way that registered as significant. She was not visibly distressed. She showed no outward sign of fear. The ordinary texture of her days appeared intact in every way that the people around her could see. That normalcy, that perfectly unremarkable surface, is part of what made what came next so impossible to process. There was no warning anyone could look back on and say, there it was. We should have seen it. When she didn't appear where she was expected, the people around her offered the grace that most of us extend to each other. In those first uncertain hours, a miscommunication, an overlooked message, maybe she needed a little space. People reach for those explanations because the alternative is too large to pick up without more evidence. But the hours passed without resolution. The days that followed brought no contact, no explanation, no trace of where she had gone. And the quiet that settled in behind her absence had a particular quality to it, something heavier than ordinary silence that nobody in her circle wanted to be the first to name. The missing persons report was filed. Investigators arrived and began asking questions. Her name entered the systems designed to track the lost, and slowly, in ways that no one entirely controlled, the case began to take on a life of its own. In the press, in the community, in the minds of strangers who had never met Nancy Guthrie, but felt compelled, as people so often do, to try to solve what those with actual authority could not seem to. Before the case, before the coverage, before any of it, Nancy Guthrie was living an ordinary, anchored life. That is where the real story starts. Not with her disappearance, not with the investigation, but with the specific and unhurried reality of who she was, when she was still fully present in the world. Because understanding that, understanding her as a person rather than a puzzle, is the only honest way to understand what her absence meant, and why the assumptions that followed took the particular shape they did. She was grounded in her routines the way most people are, without ever thinking about it. The familiar places she returned to without deliberation. The people she checked in with on a rhythm that had become second nature. The work she showed up to consistently, and the relationships she tended with a quiet regularity that only becomes fully visible once it has stopped. Those around her describe a woman who was not restless, not straining toward anything, not giving off even a faint signal that she was building, privately, toward any kind of dramatic departure from the life she was living. That matters in ways that go beyond simply painting a picture of who she was. It matters because one of the first things investigators evaluate when someone disappears is whether the absence appears voluntary, whether the person had been withdrawing from relationships, from obligations, from the small structural rituals that hold a life in place. In Nancy's case, according to those who knew her best, none of those signals were present. She was engaged with her life. She spoke about the future in the way people do when they expect to be in it. That behavioral profile carries real weight. It is also precisely why the theories that emerged felt so plausible to so many people. Someone who wasn't pulling away, wasn't retreating, wasn't giving anyone a reason to expect a departure, and then simply vanished. The easiest place the mind lands in that situation is external harm. Someone did this to her. She didn't leave. She was taken. And somewhere in the people and circumstances around her, someone was holding a secret they hadn't yet been forced to release. That conclusion had emotional logic. It gave the absence a cause. It gave the cause a potential face. And once a theory settles into emotional logic, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to move, even when the actual evidence begins quietly pointing somewhere else. Her family held tightly to the version of Nancy they knew, the stable, forward-looking, genuinely present woman who had no obvious reason to vanish. They held onto it because it was true, and because the alternative, the possibility, that there were rooms inside her that they had never been invited into, was a grief all of its own to contemplate. When investigators began working the case seriously, what gradually emerged was not the picture the public narrative had constructed. This is not unusual. The distance between what a case appears to be from the outside and what it actually contains on the inside is almost always wider than people expect. Public narratives assemble themselves from the visible fragments, the details that surface in reporting, the impressions of neighbors, the emotional architecture of whatever feels most plausible to people who are not inside the investigation. Actual investigations are built from something slower and harder: evidence, records, patterns, the details that never make it into any public account because they haven't been confirmed, or because no one yet understood what they meant. In Nancy's case, according to reports, investigators encountered fairly early on certain information that complicated the kidnapping theory. Not information that immediately ruled it out. Investigations almost never work that cleanly, but information that introduced real uncertainty about whether the circumstances of her disappearance were actually what they appeared to be from the outside. Financial records were reviewed, as they are in virtually every missing persons case. Communications were examined carefully. The movements of people connected to her were traced and cross-referenced. And what began to take shape, slowly and with considerable care, was a portrait of a woman whose interior life had contained pressures that hadn't been visible to most of the. But that same instinct, in the context of an investigation, can become an obstacle with real consequences. It can direct focus toward suspects who were never involved. It can place pressure on people whose only real connection to the case is that they happen to be nearby. It can cause lasting harm to real people who did nothing wrong. According to reports, questions were indeed raised about certain individuals in Nancy's life during the period when the kidnapping and cover-up theories were at their most active. People who cared about her, who had simply been part of her world, found themselves viewed through a lens of suspicion that the actual evidence, examined carefully, did not support. That kind of suspicion does not simply dissolve once the narrative moves. It leaves behind something that takes far longer to clear than it did to build. Investigators kept following the evidence. That is what they are required to do, regardless of what the surrounding conversation looks like. But the gap between what the investigation was actually finding and what the public had settled on, as the accepted version of events, had grown wide enough that when the truth finally began to emerge into something that could be spoken plainly, it would require almost everyone who had been following this case to reckon with the distance between what they believed and what was real. No charges were ever filed. No arrest was ever made, because according to what the investigation had been building toward, there was no perpetrator. The case was not that kind of case, and the people who had been carrying the informal weight of public suspicion, whose names had circulated in certain conversations with a particular heaviness attached, had not done what they were suspected of doing. That realization didn't arrive with any fanfare. It settled in slowly, and it brought with it its own specific, complicated grief. When the truth of what happened to Nancy Guthrie came into clearer focus, it did not arrive in a single defining moment. It almost never does. The resolution of cases like this tends to happen in increments. A piece of confirmed evidence here, an official report quietly filed there, a finding communicated to the family before the wider world is told anything at all. The family tends to be first, and first means having to decide what to do with knowing before the knowing has any public shape yet. How to hold a truth the world hasn't been told. How to begin mourning something that hasn't yet been named out loud. According to those close to the situation, what the extended investigation ultimately pointed toward was not foul play. What emerged was something internal, something that had lived inside Nancy's own experience of her life, pressures and a pain that had not been shared with most of the people around her, something that had accumulated in the unseen spaces, and that had ultimately led her somewhere that no one who loved her would have wanted her to arrive at alone. No official determination made publicly available has confirmed every specific detail. The matter remains, in certain respects, still under investigation, and the careful language of official findings does not always carry the full weight of what those close to a case come to understand over time. But the direction of the evidence, the direction that careful, responsible investigators had been moving in for some time, pointed clearly away from external harm and towards something far more interior, far more human. That kind of truth is harder to hold than a villain would have been. A villain gives grief somewhere to go. It transforms mourning into a demand for justice, and justice is at least a direction, something to move toward, something that gives the loss a shape and a purpose and a reason to fight. When there is no villain, the grief doesn't have anywhere to direct itself. It simply sits in the room with you, in all of its weight, asking nothing except that you not look away from it. For Nancy's family, this reckoning was private long before it was anything else. They had to absorb a truth that reframed everything that came before it. The years of searching, the years of suspicion cast on people who were innocent, the years of questions that turned out to have been aimed in the wrong direction. They had to find a way to grieve not only her absence, but the particular shape of what the truth turned out to be. And they had to do it while the world around them was still operating on a version of events that was no longer accurate. That is an extraordinary weight to carry. It deserves to be said without qualification. After the truth surfaces in a case like this, the narrative does not simply reset. The world does not cleanly correct itself the way an investigation does. The years of speculation leave something behind. The people who were informally suspected, in quiet conversations, in online forums, in the social accounting that communities conduct, when they are trying to make sense of something frightening, they carry that forward even once the suspicion has been officially set aside. Reputations that were quietly damaged over years do not repair themselves on any timeline. Comparable to the damage, the energy that built the suspicion is rarely the energy that dismantles it. That asymmetry is one of the less examined costs of cases like this, and it is real. And the family, the people who held her most closely, who knew her most specifically, who loved her in the irreducible way that you can only love someone you have actually lived alongside, they face an aftermath that belongs entirely to them, because they are now holding two separate griefs at once. The grief of her absence, which has been their companion for years, and the grief of the truth, which arrived later and differently, and demanded a kind of processing for which there is no real guide. There is also something larger that Nancy's story raises, something that extends beyond the specific facts of this case into a question that is far more universal. People in pain hide it from the people who love them all the time, not because they want to deceive anyone, not because they have any desire to leave those people to wonder and suffer, but because of something deeply human, the instinct to protect the people closest to you from the weight you are carrying, the quiet, sometimes devastating conviction that the burden is yours to manage alone, that bringing it to someone else would only add to what they already have to carry. The distance between how a person appears on the surface and what they are actually living through inside is almost always larger than we assume. That distance is not a moral failing. It is the shape of how certain people, often the most capable seeming ones, the steady ones, the people others depend on, survive inside their own suffering. They hold the surface in place. They keep showing up, and sometimes, without anyone who loves them ever having the chance to intervene, the interior quietly becomes more than they can hold alone. What Nancy needed, and what the people who loved her could not offer, because they had no way of knowing it was needed, was not protection from an outside threat. It was something quieter and infinitely harder to reach. The simple knowledge that the weight she had been carrying was something she did not have to carry by herself, that the people around her could hold some of it, if only she had let them know it was there. That asking would not have broken anything irreplaceable. Whether that knowledge could have changed the outcome is not a question anyone can answer with certainty. No official conclusion has resolved every dimension of what happened. The matter, in certain respects, remains open. But the questions this case leaves behind are no longer investigative ones. They are human questions, the kind that exist in the space between people who love each other, the kind that ask us, quietly and persistently, to look a little more carefully at the person standing right beside us. The stories that stay with us longest are rarely the ones that end with a clean answer and a closed door. They are the ones that leave something behind, a feeling that won't quite settle, a shift in how you see something you thought you already understood, a question that follows you home. Nancy Guthrie's story is one of those. Not because it is dramatic in the way those early theories promised it would be, not because there is a guilty party whose capture brings relief to the people who needed it most, but because it is true in a way that is far more common than most of us acknowledge, and far more painful precisely because of how ordinary it is. People suffer in silence all around us, not loudly, not in ways we are trained to recognize from a distance. They show up for work. They remember your birthday. They ask about your children. They laugh at the right moments. They keep their routines and maintain their relationships and give every available outward signal that they are fine. And inside all of that continued functioning, something entirely different is happening, something the surface was never designed to reveal. Nancy Guthrie was a real woman. That is worth saying again and holding for a moment. She was not a case to be solved or a theory to be tested or a narrative to be constructed on a forum by people who never knew her name before she disappeared. She was a person, fully and specifically a person, complicated and human and carrying things that most of the people who loved her never had the chance to know about. She deserved more time. She deserved to know, in some form she could actually feel, that the weight she was carrying did not have to belong entirely to her. Her family has endured something that resists easy description. They searched. They waited. They held her name in their hands carefully for years, keeping it from disappearing the way things disappear when